everyone, welcome back to The Mystic in the Woods. I'm Kate, and today we are going to start a new series here on the channel all about tarot and shadow work. So in this series, we're going to do a variety of things like spreads and methods and things like that for using tarot to assist in our shadow work. But we're also going to be talking about individual cards and how they relate to shadow work, or what to do with them if they come up with a shadow work reading, or what they can teach us about shadow work and all these kinds of things. So today we're going to start with the Moon and the Lovers, because for me, these two cards really do kind of speak directly to shadow work. So these are going to be the two cards that if they come up in a reading, they're probably pointing me in the direction of some type of shadow work. Now, of course, if we aren't doing a shadow work reading, then the cards that come up around it and the question that has been asked and what's coming up intuitively and all of that stuff is going to change whether or not you go in the direction of shadow work. But when it comes to especially the Moon card, whenever this card comes up in a reading, 99% of the time, I'm going to look in the direction of shadow work. I'm going to start to question what is beneath the surface that needs to come to the top. So when we look at the Moon, right, we are looking at a generally fairly dark card, okay? One that often readers will talk about being the dark night of the soul, about being in the shadow and in the unconscious and bringing things to the surface, right? It's sort of that murky card. It is a card that took me some time as a reader to get a grip on, because there is this idea of what's real and what's not, right? So when we are, like, let's just take the actual moon. Let's look at the literal moon up in the sky for a second. It goes through cycles, it impacts the tide, and under the moonlight, shadows start to blur together, and what's real and what's shadow starts to become hard to see, right? We do get shadows in moonlight, but depending on the phase that the moon is in, it starts to get into this what's real and what's not, and how do I see clearly and all that type of thing, right? Now, when we talk about the moon in tarot, we're also talking about, like I said, bringing something to the surface. So if we think about shadow work really being the unconscious, what we see above the water, that's our consciousness. That's what your ego, that's what you are consciously aware of. Like right now, I'm consciously aware of talking to my camera and the cards in front of me and all of these kinds of things, right? That's what I'm consciously aware of. The unconscious, where we do that shadow work, where the human shadow is, down deep in the unconscious, that can be sort of attributed to or compared to what is below the water. What is underneath the water that we might be able to get glimpses of, but not quite. And it's very, again, that sort of liminality of what's real and what's not, and what is it and where is it, and all of that type of thing. So when the moon comes up in a reading for me, so this is the one from the Darkness of Light Tarot, this is the Rider-Waite-Smith imagery from the Modern Hue Tarot, we're really going to start, I am going to immediately start to go, okay, what's below the surface of this? Okay, sometimes we're going to get into that dark night of the soul thing, which for me, I think really comes into, if the moon is about the unconscious, it's about when we're really in that unconscious space and we're almost starting to almost struggle with what is our unconscious versus what is the consciousness, when all of that is coming up to the surface. So for me, the moon is the shadow work card. It is the card in tarot that's like, hey, look at the unconscious. Look what's beneath the surface. So depending on the topic that we're reading on, I'm very likely, like 90% of the time, probably going to go straight to what's below the surface, what's at the root of this, what is it that we're not seeing. And then depending on what we're reading on, it may point us in the direction of it isn't as it appears. There is something below the surface. Now, I want to give you an example. This is what really helped for me to really understand the moon card. Because the moon is about bringing that unconscious to the surface where we can see it and understand it and befriend it. That's what shadow work is for as well. So if you think about like all the werewolf books and movies, right? generally, not always, of course, but in a lot of these werewolf stories, the more that the person tries to fight and control or avoid their wolf, the harder it is for them to control the wolf, the less they remember what has happened when they're in their wolf form, right? The more that they try to resist it, the more it takes over and does things that they don't like, usually in these stories, right? Whereas when they surrender, they work with their wolf, they befriend it, then they can work cohesively and not only have more consciousness, more awareness, and more control at the end of the day of what they do when they're in their werewolf form. A lot of these characters start to tap into the benefits that their wolf can bring to them while they're in their human form. Because when something is unconscious, when it's below the surface and we don't have any awareness of it, then it's really hard to solve whatever's going on top of the surface, right? This is why icebergs take down ships. Not because of the piece we can see above the water, but because what's underneath the water. So this idea of bringing it up to the surface and befriending it is what brings us to the Lover's card. So this is the Lover's card in the Rider-Waite-Smith imagery. However, this is my favorite depiction of the Lover's card so far. This is from the Nameless One Tarot and Oracle. So what we have is the dove, and we have the dove's skeleton. And this card is, yes, okay, of course the Lover's card can mean two people or something like that, but this is a shadow work series, right? And so yes, sometimes when this card comes up, even within shadow work, I'm going to look at a person and their relationship. However, a lot of times, most of the time, for me, this is about two aspects of myself or the person that I'm working with. So it's the conscious and the unconscious, the masculine and the feminine, the whatever two opposing aspects we have, and bringing them together so that again we can befriend it. So in the guidebook for this, she has an affirmation, because each of these cards has a sigil on it, and then she has a sigil affirmation. And this one says, I am in total harmony both internally and externally. And she talks about how in this image, neither one is more or less the true dove. The dove requires both its external state and its internal skeleton in order to be a functional, full dove, right? It needs both of these pieces. It can't have one without the other and still be fully functional. So this gets, like I said, into, the various aspects of ourself, and even the bigger question of being fully human and fully divine, and reconciling that so that we can work through this life in an empowered form. Now, the other thing I like about the Lover's card is that we do have, of course, and here's just a couple more depictions of it just so we can, kind of see them. We have it called the Lovers, right? This card is about love. So it's about... I saw a Megan Watterson quote the other day, or heard her say something on a podcast. I was on a podcast where she said something along the lines of, what's the point of love if we don't have anywhere to shine it? And she was referring to loving pieces of ourselves. And so for me, shadow work really, really is about bringing something to the surface that we are either unaware of or ashamed of or have carved away. And I have a whole shadow work video you can go watch. And bringing that into our awareness where we can integrate it and learn to love ourselves. Because usually what we hate most in others is something we hate in ourselves. So really, if we want to heal the world, it starts with learning to love the pieces of us that we don't currently like. So here's another little, here, I just want to show you guys a couple more card depictions here. So here's the moon. This is from the Ember and Aura Tarot. And in this depiction, we have these two pieces of the human, right? And then in the Lover's card, again, we have that unity and that duality. So when we look at these two cards together, for me, again, it's about bringing something to the surface and then integrating it and to become whole. In the Tarot of the Abyss, we have this is the Lover's card, which I love because it's so connected. It's not people, so it kind of gets us away from that. And if you know about how tree roots work and mycelium and that whole network below the surface, we're really looking at interconnectedness here. All of the different pieces that make us whole. And once we unite the pieces within us, then we are more capable of bringing our full self into a relationship or something like that. So for me, the whole point of shadow work is to bring awareness to something I was unaware of before, and bring love to where it wasn't, where it didn't used to exist, so that I can unify all of these pieces of myself. And I think we see that in the Lovers and the Moon card. And again, we're starting this series with these cards because to me they wrap up what shadow work is. And also when either of these two cards pop up in a reading, especially the Moon, really for me, whether I'm reading for myself or somebody else, 90+% of the time it is about shadow work. It is about bringing something that is bringing something to the surface, right? So what is actually causing the reaction or the wounding or the whatever. And then the Lovers card, even when this card pops up in a reading, and it's going to depend a little bit on the deck that I'm working with, even when the Lovers card pops up in a reading, more often than not, I have found that it has to do with separate pieces of the person sitting in front of me as opposed to them and someone else, although sometimes that is of course the case. So these are just some of my thoughts on the Lovers and the Devil card, or the Lovers and the Moon card, excuse me. We'll get to the Devil card because that is also a huge shadow work piece for me. But I wanted to start this series with these two cards. So if you have any questions about this, if there's anything you'd like to see more on in upcoming tarot and shadow work videos, or if there is a tarot topic you would like me to cover in this series, let me know and I will see you in the next video. Bye.